You think you know what happened to women in Viking raids. Ships arrive, warriors take captives, longboats sail home. But the real story begins after the dragon prows disappear over the horizon. Inside those timber halls stretching across Scandinavia, a documented system of violence unfolds that makes Hollywood Vikings look like children playing dress-up. What happened to captured women inside Viking Longhouses? What did Norse law actually say about their rights? How did archaeology prove what the sagas tried to hide? The Longhouse wasn't just shelter, it was a machine for breaking people. Archaeologists in Trelleborg found slave quarters built directly into the hall foundations, stone anchoring rings, iron shackles still attached to support posts. The women brought back weren't guests. They were inventory. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from archaeological reports from the National Museum of Denmark and medieval Icelandic law codes. Now back to the story. 991, Bertfirth's Chronicle records. Vikings hitting Malden with 43 ships. They returned to Denmark with 216 captives, women and children. The sagas call them thralls. The law codes spell out what that means. In the Gragas, Iceland's medieval law collection, a female slave has no legal protection against sexual violence from her owner. None. The text is explicit. She cannot refuse. She cannot testify. She has no recourse. Ribe excavations revealed the economics. Slave collars forged on site. Iron ingots shipped from Norway specifically for restraints. The metalwork tells the story the chronicles won't. These weren't makeshift operations. This was industrial-scale human trafficking with supply chains spanning the North Sea. Dublin slave markets operated openly from 825 to 1170. The Annals of Ulster record prices. One Irish woman sold for 3 ounces of silver in 943. That's the same price as 6 milk cows. Ibn Fadlan, writing in 922, describes Norse slave dealers on the Volga. He watched them inspect women like livestock. Teeth, limbs, fertility signs. The buyers weren't interested in servants. They were investing in breeding stock. Inside the Longhouse, archaeology reveals the system. Hedeby excavations found separate sleeping areas. Free women got raised platforms near the hearth. Slaves slept on straw directly on the dirt floor. Parasitology studies of Viking Age feces show the difference. Free family members had normal intestinal worm loads. Slave areas showed extreme parasite concentrations, malnutrition, disease, short lifespans. The Laxdæla saga describes Melkorka, an Irish princess enslaved in 930. She serves Huskuld as concubine for 15 years, bears him a son, never speaks Norse publicly, pretending she can't understand. The saga treats this as clever strategy. Modern analysis reveals trauma response, selective mutism under sustained sexual violence. Skeletal remains tell colder truths. Oseberg burial, 834. 2 women interred with a ship. The primary occupant shows signs of elite status, gold jewelry, silk imports, ceremonial artifacts. The secondary skeleton tells a different story, healed bone fractures. Vitamin deficiencies, tool marks on the spine suggesting hard labor. She was likely a slave sacrificed for the burial. Voluntary? The broken bones suggest otherwise. York Archaeological Trust found a mass grave from 943. 12 females, ages 14 to 35. All show evidence of violent death. Sword cuts, arrow wounds, blunt force trauma to skulls. But here's the detail that matters. Half were pregnant when they died. This wasn't battle aftermath. This was systematic execution. Norse law codes reveal the legal framework. The Gulathing Law, compiled around 1150 but reflecting earlier traditions, states that a slave owner can kill female thralls who become pregnant by other men. The penalty? A fine equivalent to 3 silver marks. The same cost as a decent horse. The woman's life had a price tag. Bergen excavations uncovered cooking areas that tell the story. Separate hearths for slaves, different food remains. Free Norse ate meat, bread, dairy products. Slave quarters show fish scraps, grain husks, vegetable peelings, survival rations. Just enough calories to maintain work capacity and reproduction. The sagas romanticize some slave women who rose to prominence, Theory in Denmark, Astrid in Norway. But legal documents show the exception proves the rule. For every concubine who gained status through royal birth, thousands disappeared into anonymity. No names, no stories, just archaeological shadows in the dirt. Ibn Rusta, writing in 900, describes Norse funeral customs involving slaves. When a prominent man died, his female slaves were questioned. Who wants to die with him? Volunteers were drugged, raped by multiple men, then strangled and stabbed. The ceremony was religious obligation, sacred duty. The woman's consent was theater. Excavations at Kaupang, Norway's first trading town, reveal the scale. Slave quarters built to house 300 women at peak capacity. Ironworking areas designed specifically for restraint production. Harbor facilities designed for human cargo. This wasn't raiding for personal use. This was commercial enterprise with infrastructure investment. The Gragas law code specifies breeding regulations. A slave woman who bears 3 children to her owner gains certain protections. She cannot be sold to another household. She gets slightly better food rations. She can work inside the main hall instead of the outbuildings. This was progress in Viking legal thinking. 3 pregnancies bought basic survival rights. Genetic studies of modern Icelanders reveal the demographic impact. Mitochondrial DNA shows 60% of founding females came from Celtic populations, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. But Y chromosome analysis shows 90% male founders were Norse. The math is simple. Most women arrived as slaves. Most men arrived as owners. Archaeological evidence from Greenland tells the endgame. Norse settlements collapsed around 1450. Climate change. Resource depletion. Social breakdown. But the skeletal remains from the final decades show something specific. Adult female skeletons almost disappear from the record. Infant mortality spikes to nearly 100%. When resources became scarce, slaves died first. The last excavation at Herjolfsnes revealed the final detail. A Norse cemetery from the 1400s, 47 burials, 38 males, 9 females. All the women show evidence of malnutrition and hard labor. The clothing fragments suggest high-status materials, imported wool, silver threading. These weren't slaves anymore. These were the last free Norse women working themselves to death trying to maintain a dying civilization. But here's what archaeology found in the permafrost that changes everything. Clothing preservation revealed textile signatures from 3 different cultural traditions: Norse wool, Celtic linen, Arctic fur techniques. The women weren't just victims. They were adapting, combining, surviving, creating hybrid technologies that outlasted their captors. The final longhouse excavated in Greenland contained something unexpected. 3 separate food preparation areas, different cooking techniques, different tool traditions. The Irish slaves had taught their captors how to preserve fish using Celtic salt-curing methods. The Pictish women had introduced new weaving techniques that produced warmer clothing. The Sami captives had shared Arctic survival skills. The women brought more than labor to the longhouses. They brought knowledge that kept Norse settlements alive for centuries longer than pure Scandinavian techniques could have managed. The brutality was documented, the systematic violence was real, but the cultural exchange was deeper than the sagas ever admitted. The last documented female slave appears in Bergen City records from 1267. Solveig the Thrall sold for 4 marks silver to a merchant named Eric. The document lists her skills: weaving, cooking, midwifery, reading Latin. She could calculate trade ratios and speak 4 languages. The price wasn't for a body, it was for a walking library of survival techniques. Modern excavations in the Faroe Islands found the final piece: a longhouse foundation from 1300 with unusual architectural features. Separate entrances, divided work areas, mixed tool assemblages showing both Norse and Celtic techniques. The women had gradually transformed the longhouses from prisons into hybrid cultural centers. But the permafrost at Garter Cathedral preserved one more detail that reframes everything. Textile fragments showing repair techniques unknown in medieval Scandinavia, stitching patterns from Ireland, dye formulas from Scotland, thread spinning methods from the Hebrides. The slave women hadn't just survived. They had preserved their home cultures inside the longhouses and passed them down through generations. The violence was systematic. The legal framework was brutal. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. But the women who entered those longhouses as captives ultimately became the carriers of knowledge that outlived their captors. When the Norse settlements collapsed, their techniques survived in local traditions that archaeologists are still discovering today. Trondheim excavations from 2015 revealed daily routines inside the longhouses. Slave women woke before dawn. Archaeological evidence shows separate fire lighting areas, different flint types. The thralls used inferior fire-starting materials while maintaining the main hearth for free family members. Burn patterns on post holes show they worked 18-hour days minimum. The Frostathing law specifies punishment for slave women who refuse work. First offense: reduced food for 7 days. Second offense: 20 lashes with birch rods. Third offense: the owner could brand her face or sell her to traders heading east. The law codes treat these women as livestock with troubleshooting guides. Coprolite analysis from Jorvik reveals the diet differences in stark detail. Free Norse women consumed meat proteins equivalent to 40 grams daily. Slave women averaged 12 grams. Their fecal remains show they ate food scraps, bone marrow from discarded bones, and intestinal contents from butchered animals. survival eating that kept them functional but malnourished. The timing of meals tells another story. Isotope analysis of bone collagen shows free women ate regular meals throughout the day. Slave women show feeding patterns consistent with single daily meals, usually consumed after dark. They worked all day on empty stomachs, then received scraps after the free household finished eating. Amber beads found in slave quarters at Ribe weren't jewelry, they were currency. Documentary evidence from Hamburg shows Norse traders paid slave women in amber pieces for sexual services during market visits. The beads functioned as brothel tokens in a regulated prostitution system. Archaeological counts suggest individual women serviced 8 to 12 clients during major trading seasons. The Erbygdis saga records temperature measurements inside Snorri's longhouse during winter. Free family sleeping areas maintained 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Slave quarters averaged 28 degrees. The difference killed, and hypothermia deaths among thralls increased 40% during harsh winters. Cold was another control mechanism. Textile remains from Borgund show the clothing hierarchy. Free Norse women wore wool cloaks dyed with expensive imported colors. Slave women wore undyed wool or linen shifts, but the stitching patterns reveal something else. The slave clothing shows repair techniques from multiple cultural traditions, Irish darning methods, Scottish patching styles, Celtic embroidery adapted for maintenance rather than decoration. The Christine saga describes conversion ceremonies around 1000. Christian bishops demanded Norse households free their slaves as proof of religious sincerity, but the legal loopholes were immediate. Freed slaves became indentured servants with 20-year contracts. Different name, same system. Archaeological evidence shows no change in housing arrangements or diet quality after official conversion. Bone chemistry from Trelleborg reveals the breeding control methods. Slave women show elevated levels of ergot alkaloids in their skeletal remains. Ergot causes miscarriages and reduces fertility. The compounds appear seasonally, suggesting deliberate administration to prevent pregnancies during winter months, when food was scarce and infant survival low. The Hakonar saga mentions Astrid of the Obotrites, captured in 962. She serves as wet nurse to King Haakon's children while her own infant dies of neglect. The saga presents this as noble sacrifice. Modern medical analysis reveals forced lactation, a documented torture method that damages both the woman's body and psychological state. Excavations at Apocra uncovered a specialized building dated to 850. Stone foundations with drainage systems, iron rings embedded in walls at shoulder height. Straw covering burned and replaced regularly. The structure matches contemporary descriptions of rape buildings where multiple slave women were kept available for visiting warriors and traders. The Brennunjals saga records legal proceedings from 1015. Flosi Thordarson sues his neighbor for using his slave woman without permission. The fine was 12 ounces of silver. The same penalty applied for stealing a prize bull. The legal system treated rape as property damage, not violence against a person. Archaeological evidence from Sigtuna shows the religious integration. Christian churches built on former longhouse sites contain foundation stones, with iron shackle anchors still embedded. The priests didn't destroy the slave quarters. They built their altars directly on top of them, literally covering the evidence while maintaining the same social structure. The Gisla saga describes Hallgerdr's punishment methods. Slave women who broke household items had fingers broken with hammers. Those who spoke without permission had tongues pierced with iron needles. The saga treats these as reasonable discipline. Archaeological evidence from Westman Islands shows skeletal remains with precisely these injury patterns. Carbon isotope analysis of teeth from Kaupang reveals dietary control extended to childhood. Children born to slave women show malnutrition markers from birth. They nursed from malnourished mothers, then received reduced rations as soon as they were weaned. Stunted growth was intentional. Smaller slaves required less food and were easier to control. The Volsunga saga mentions Sinis Irish slaves who know herb lore. They prepare medicines that heal battle wounds faster than Norse treatments, but the same women are forced to prepare poisons for enemies. Their medical knowledge became weapons in political conflicts they had no stake in. Excavations beneath Copenhagen's Nikolai Church revealed the transition evidence. Viking Age slave quarters directly beneath the medieval Christian cemetery. Radiocarbon dating shows continuous occupation from 900 to 1200. The same families enslaved the same bloodlines for 3 centuries. Slavery became hereditary caste system. The Laxdela saga describes Melkorka's son Olaf, born of rape but claiming royal Irish heritage. When he travels to Ireland seeking recognition, King Merkjartan accepts him as grandson. But Melkorka remains enslaved in Iceland. Royal blood in the child meant nothing for the mother's legal status. Dental analysis from Bergen shows specific wear patterns on slave women's teeth. Grooves consistent with thread cutting and rope work. They used their teeth as tools because their hands were occupied with other labor. The dental wear accelerated tooth loss, making them appear older and reducing their value in slave markets. The Cormac saga records Steinger's household management. She assigns specific slave women to milk 36 cows daily. The milk production records survive in later documents. Each woman handled 6 cows, working from dawn to dusk during calving season. Milk production was mechanized labor with human components. Chemical analysis of cooking pots from Rybe shows the meal preparation hierarchy. Separate vessels for slave food contained higher levels of salt and preservatives. The food was prepared to last longer, not taste better. Slaves ate preserved rations, while free households consumed fresh meals prepared immediately before eating. The Thordr saga describes Gudrun's weaving workshop with 12 slave women. They produce cloth that sells in markets from Dublin to Novgorod. The saga lists the profits, but not the working conditions. Archaeological evidence from similar workshops shows 18-hour workdays with minimal breaks, production quotas enforced through food rationing. Parasitological evidence from Hedeby latrine pits shows the disease burden. Slave quarters had intestinal parasite loads indicating severe malnutrition and poor sanitation, but they also show medicinal plant remains suggesting self-treatment. The women were using traditional remedies to keep themselves functional despite the conditions. The Landnámabók records specific cases. Un the Deep-Minded arrives in Iceland around 870 with 20 female thralls. She assigns them specific breeding duties with her male slaves. The text lists their children by name and parentage. These weren't relationships. These were managed breeding programs with documented outcomes. Gotland picture stones show the visual evidence, carved scenes depicting ships arriving with bound captives. But the details matter. The women are shown in different clothing than their captors, simpler weaves, shorter hemlines indicating lower status. Some stones show them carrying Norse children on their backs while working, multitasking forced labor. The Ibn Fadlan account gets darker with closer reading. He describes a ship burial where they select a volunteer slave girl for sacrifice. But his text reveals she tried to escape twice before the ceremony. They drugged her with alcohol and narcotic plants. She wasn't volunteering. She was being prepared for execution while chemically unable to resist. Archaeological evidence from Lund shows the medical reality. The skeletal remains of slave women reveal pelvic injuries consistent with repeated difficult births. Bone formations suggesting they carried heavy loads constantly, vertebrae compression from hauling water buckets and firewood. Their bodies were tools that wore out from overuse. The Sturlunga saga mentions Gudrun the Thrall, captured from the Orkney Islands in 1198. She bore 7 children to 3 different owners over 15 years. The saga treats this as unremarkable, standard utilization of female property. Her children were automatically slaves unless freed by specific legal declaration. Excavations at Tisu, Denmark, revealed the longhouse hierarchy in architectural detail. Free women's quarters had wooden floors raised 8 inches above ground level, insulation layers of straw and hides. Slave areas were dirt floors with drainage ditches to handle waste and water runoff. Even the building design enforced status differences. The Jomsvikinga saga describes training young slave women for different purposes, some for household labor, some for textile production, some specifically for sexual service to visiting traders and allies. The text lists this as diplomatic courtesy. Modern analysis reveals systematic sexual trafficking with political cover. Carbon dating of Birka graves shows the timeline, from 800 to 950 dollars. Female slave burials appear regularly. After 950 stars, they almost disappear from the archaeological record. This matches historical sources describing increased Christian influence and changing legal attitudes toward slavery. But the change took 150 years to implement fully. The Gragas contains specific regulations about pregnant slave women. If she miscarries due to violence from her owner, he owes no compensation to anyone. If she dies in childbirth, he can claim the child as property if it survives. If both die, he suffers no legal penalty. The law treated reproduction as industrial process with acceptable loss rates. Ribe archaeological layers show the economic integration. Slave quarters contained specialized tools for textile production, spindle whorls, loom weights, thread cutting blades, but the finished cloth appears in high status contexts throughout the settlement. The women were producing luxury goods while living in poverty conditions. The Orkneyinga saga records Thorfinn's raids on Scotland around 1040. He returns with 67 captives. The text specifies 38 were young women, but harbor excavations at Kirkwall show expansion of slave housing facilities in the same period. Infrastructure investment matching the human cargo influx. Skeletal analysis from Bergen reveals the age patterns. Most female slave remains show death between ages 22 and 35, significantly lower than free Norse women who averaged 45 to 50 years lifespan. The combination of malnutrition, overwork, Repeated pregnancies and violence created a mortality crisis in the enslaved population. The Grettis saga mentions Hallgerd's Irish slave women in 1030. They weave special cloaks using techniques unknown to Norse textile workers. The saga describes the cloth as superior quality. Modern textile archaeology confirms Celtic weaving produced stronger, warmer fabrics than standard Scandinavian methods. The slaves were technological assets. Excavations at Kopang revealed the supply chain details. Tools specifically designed for restraining captives during transport. Iron-like shackles with ship-specific mounting points. Wooden collars carved with Norse runes marking ownership. This wasn't improvised violence. This was engineered system for human trafficking. The Egil saga describes Thorolf's concubine Sigrid, captured from Courland in 920. She speaks 4 languages and manages his household accounts. The saga presents this as fortunate for Thorolf. But legal documents from Gotland show similar cases where multilingual slave women served as translators for international trade negotiations. Parasitology studies from Hedeby show the health crisis. Slave quarters had parasite loads 5 times higher than free areas. Intestinal worms carried on lice, skin parasites, respiratory infections. The crowded, unsanitary conditions created disease breeding grounds that affected entire settlements. The Longhouses were prisons. But they were also schools where enslaved women taught their captors how to survive in climates their Nordic techniques couldn't handle. The horror and the adaptation happened simultaneously, documented in bone fragments and textile remains that tell both stories without contradiction. But the permafrost at Falsey Church preserved the final testimony, a wooden tablet with runic inscription from 1390. The text reads, "Ingrid the slave taught us the fish cure that saved 23 through the hungry winter." Even at the end, as Norse Greenland collapsed, they remembered which knowledge had kept them alive. Ice preserves everything, even the gratitude the sagas tried to forget.